What caused the War of 1812?
The war between the young United States and powerful Great Britain largely came about because of France. After the French Navy was crushed by the British under Admiral Nelson. 1758 to 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, Napoleon turned to economic warfare in his long struggle with the British. He directed all countries under French control not to trade with Great Britain. Its economy dependent on trade, Britain struck back by imposing a naval blockade on France, which soon interfered with U.S. shipping. Ever since the struggle between the two European powers began in 1793, the United States tried to remain neutral. But the interruption of shipping to and from the continent and the search and seizure of ships posed significant problems to the American export business. In 1807, Great Britain had issued an order in council that required even neutral vessels destined for a continental port to stop first in England. Napoleon countered with the Milan Decree, which stated that any neutral vessel that had submitted to British search be seized. Back in America, the people of New England, the region most dependent on shipping, nevertheless vehemently opposed entering into war with the British. But the country's economy was depressed as a result of the interruption of exports, and the U.S. Congress declared war on June 18, 1812. In these days before telegraph and radio, the United States did not know that 2 days before, on June 16, Britain had withdrawn its orders in council, lifting its policy of shipping interference, which had been the chief reason for the war declaration. Thus the two countries engaged in fighting for the next 2.5 years. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent officially ended the war. But once again, poor communication led to fighting, 2 weeks after the treaty was signed. Troops in New Orleans, unaware of this event, fought for control over the Mississippi River in the worst battle of the entire conflict. Though both the United States and Great Britain claimed victory in the War of 1812, neither side had gained anything.
What caused the War of 1812?
The war between the young United States and powerful Great Britain largely came about because of France. After the French Navy was crushed by the British under Admiral Nelson. 1758 to 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, Napoleon turned to economic warfare in his long struggle with the British. He directed all countries under French control not to trade with Great Britain. Its economy dependent on trade, Britain struck back by imposing a naval blockade on France, which soon interfered with U.S. shipping. Ever since the struggle between the two European powers began in 1793, the United States tried to remain neutral. But the interruption of shipping to and from the continent and the search and seizure of ships posed significant problems to the American export business. In 1807, Great Britain had issued an order in council that required even neutral vessels destined for a continental port to stop first in England. Napoleon countered with the Milan Decree, which stated that any neutral vessel that had submitted to British search be seized. Back in America, the people of New England, the region most dependent on shipping, nevertheless vehemently opposed entering into war with the British. But the country's economy was depressed as a result of the interruption of exports. And the U.S. Congress declared war on June 18, 1812. In these days before telegraph and radio, the United States did not know that 2 days before, on June 16, Britain had withdrawn its orders in council, lifting its policy of shipping interference, which had been the chief reason for the war declaration. Thus the two countries engaged in fighting for the next 2.5 years. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent officially ended the war. But once again, poor communication led to fighting, 2 weeks after the treaty was signed. Troops in New Orleans, unaware of this event, fought for control over the Mississippi River in the worst battle of the entire conflict. Though both the United States and Great Britain claimed victory in the War of 1812, neither side had gained anything.
Who were the war hawks?
The Warhawks were a group of Republicans in the U.S. Congress who advocated war with Great Britain. Elected in 1810, the congressmen took office in 1811, the failure of the Erskine Agreement fresh in their memories. That bit of 1809 diplomacy, arranged by British minister to the United States George Erskine and the then U.S. Secretary of State James Madison, 1751 to 1836. Would have provided for the suspension of Britain's maritime practices that interfered with U.S. shipping. But the agreement fell apart when Erskine was recalled from office. The relationship between the United States and Great Britain, tenuous since 1807 due to trade embargoes and the impressment of American sailors into British service, deteriorated. The newly elected congressmen were tired of the failure of diplomacy to resolve maritime problems with the British. They further felt that the British were challenging the young United States through their policies, which purportedly included British aid to American Indians in the Northwest. Warhawk leader Henry Clay, 1777 to 1852, was named Speaker of the House. And Congress soon passed a series of resolutions to strengthen the Army and Navy. When Congress was called upon by President James Madison to declare war on the British in June of 1812, it was the Warhawks who swung the close vote. Thus the War of 1812 was declared. Some historians believe the true motive behind the Warhawks was not resolution of the shipping problems, but rather the desire to annex parts of southern Canada to the United States.
Who were the war hawks?
The Warhawks were a group of Republicans in the U.S. Congress who advocated war with Great Britain. Elected in 1810, the congressmen took office in 1811, the failure of the Erskine Agreement fresh in their memories. That bit of 1809 diplomacy, arranged by British minister to the United States George Erskine and the then U.S. Secretary of State James Madison, 1751 to 1836. Would have provided for the suspension of Britain's maritime practices that interfered with U.S. shipping. But the agreement fell apart when Erskine was recalled from office. The relationship between the United States and Great Britain, tenuous since 1807 due to trade embargoes and the impressment of American sailors into British service, deteriorated. The newly elected congressmen were tired of the failure of diplomacy to resolve maritime problems with the British. They further felt that the British were challenging the young United States through their policies, which purportedly included British aid to American Indians in the Northwest. Warhawk leader Henry Clay, 1777 to 1852, was named Speaker of the House. And Congress soon passed a series of resolutions to strengthen the Army and Navy. When Congress was called upon by President James Madison to declare war on the British in June of 1812, it was the Warhawks who swung the close vote. Thus the War of 1812 was declared. Some historians believe the true motive behind the Warhawks was not resolution of the shipping problems, but rather the desire to annex parts of southern Canada to the United States.
Who said, "We have met the enemy and they are ours"?
It was Captain Oliver Hazard Perry, 1785 to 1819, who wrote the famous words in a letter to General William Henry Harrison, 1773 to 1841, after defeating the British at the Battle of Lake Erie on September 10, 1813. An improvised U.S. squadron commanded by Captain Perry, 28 years old, achieved the victory in the War of 1812 battle. The message he sent to Harrison, who later went on to become the 9th U.S. President, was: "We have met the enemy and they are ours, 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." Perry received a gold medal and thanks from Congress for the victory.
Who said, "We have met the enemy and they are ours"?
It was Captain Oliver Hazard Perry, 1785 to 1819, who wrote the famous words in a letter to General William Henry Harrison, 1773 to 1841, after defeating the British at the Battle of Lake Erie on September 10, 1813. An improvised U.S. squadron commanded by Captain Perry, 28 years old, achieved the victory in the War of 1812 battle. The message he sent to Harrison, who later went on to become the 9th U.S. President, was: "We have met the enemy and they are ours, 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop. Perry received a gold medal and thanks from Congress for the victory.
Who said, "We have met the enemy and they are ours"?
It was Captain Oliver Hazard Perry, 1785 to 1819, who wrote the famous words in a letter to General William Henry Harrison. 1773 to 1841, after defeating the British at the Battle of Lake Erie on September 10, 1813. An improvised U.S. squadron commanded by Captain Perry, 28 years old, achieved the victory in the War of 1812 battle. The message he sent to Harrison, who later went on to become the 9th U.S. President, was: "We have met the enemy and they are ours, 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." Perry received a gold medal and thanks from Congress for the victory.
Were all the battles of the American Revolution waged in the Northeast?
No, there was also fighting in the southern colonies. But the struggle between the American colonists and the British was further complicated in the South by the presence of slaves. Landowners feared that any fighting in the vicinity would inspire slaves to revolt against them. Knowing this, the British believed they could regain control of the southern colonies more readily than those in the north. In November 1775, the British governor of Virginia offered to free any slaves who would fight for the British. As many as 2,000 black slaves accepted the offer and took up arms. But there were also patriots in the South. It was Virginian Patrick Henry, 1736 to 1799, who uttered the famous words, "Give me liberty or give me death." In late February 1776, Patriot forces confronted and defeated pro-British colonists near Wilmington, North Carolina. The British troops who were sailing from Boston, Massachusetts, to North Carolina to join the loyal colonists arrived too late to help. They instead sailed on to Charleston, South Carolina, which was also the scene of fighting that summer.
What was the lost colony?
It was the second English colony established in America, set up in 1587 on Roanoke Island, off the coast of North Carolina. By 1590 it had disappeared without a trace. Theories surround the disappearance, though it is not known for sure what happened. Roanoke Island had also been the site of the first English colony, set up in 1585 by about 100 men who were sent there by Sir Walter Raleigh, 1554 to 1618. Raleigh had perceived the island to be a good spot for English warships that were then fighting the Spanish, to be repaired and loaded with new supplies. But the plan was not a success, the land wasn't fertile enough to support both the colonists and the Indians living nearby. And ships could not get close enough to the island since the surrounding sea proved too shallow. The colonists returned to England the following year. Meantime, Raleigh had dispatched another group of colonists from England. They arrived at Roanoke days after the original settlers left. Seeing that the site had been abandoned, all but 15 of the colonists opted to return to England. In spring 1587 Raleigh sent yet another group of colonists to America. But these ships were headed for areas near Chesapeake Bay, farther north, in present-day Virginia. Reaching the Outer Banks in July, the ship's commander refused to take the colonists to their destination and instead left them at Roanoke Island. The colonists' leader, John White, who had also been among the first settlers at Roanoke, returned to England for supplies in August 1587. However, the ongoing war between England and Spain prevented him from returning to the colony until 3 years later. Arriving back at Roanoke in August 1590, expecting to be met by family members and the 100 or so settlers, including some women and children. Instead, he discovered that the colony was abandoned. The only clue that White found was the word Croatoan, which had been engraved on a tree. The Croatoan, or Hatteras, were friendly Indians who lived on an island south of Roanoke Island. White set out to see if the colonists had joined the Hatteras Indians. But weather prevented the search and his expedition returned to England instead. Two theories explain what might have become of the lost colonists. Since the shore of Chesapeake Bay was their original destination, the colonists might have moved there but, encountering resistance, perished at the hands of the Indians. Other evidence suggests that the colonists became integrated with several Indian tribes living in North Carolina. Either way, they were never seen again by Europeans.
What were the Spanish holdings in the New World?
New Spain comprised much of the Spanish possessions in the New World during the colonial period. At its height, New Spain included what are today the southwestern United States, all of Mexico, Central America to the Isthmus of Panama, Florida, much of the West Indies, islands in the Caribbean, as well as the Philippines in the Pacific Ocean. The Viceroyalty, province governed by a representative of the monarch, was governed from the capital at Mexico City beginning in 1535. In 1821 a Mexican rebellion ended Spanish rule there, and the colonial empire of New Spain was dissolved. By 1898 Spain had relinquished all its possessions in North America. Its last holdings were the islands of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, which were ceded to the United States after Spain lost the Spanish-American War, 1898. During the colonial period, Spain also claimed other territories. in the New World in northern and western South America. Most of these holdings fell under the Viceroyalty of Peru, which was administered separately from the Viceroyalty of New Spain. These possessions were also lost by Spain by the end of the 1800s.
How did Joan of Arc become a warrior?
Joan of Arc, called the Maid of Orleans, c. 1412 to 1431, gained fame for leading the French into victory over the English in the Battle for Orleans in 1429. A year before the battle, the English forces had invaded northern France and took possession of an area that included the city of Reims, where all of France's kings were crowned in the cathedral. Thus, Charles VII, 1403 to 1461, whom France recognized as their king, had never had a proper coronation. It is said that Joan, an extraordinarily devoted Catholic who was then just a teen, appealed to Charles to allow her to go into battle against the English who were besieging Orleans. Though he was skeptical of her at first, she claimed to have heard the voices of saints, he eventually conceded. In the battlefield, Joan also overcame the doubts of the French troops and their leaders, who were understandably hesitant to follow the young girl's lead. She proved to them that she was not only capable but also successful. In April 1429, in just 10 days' time, Joan led the French to victory over the English, who fled Orleans. Still determined to see Charles properly crowned, Joan proceeded to lead a military escort for the king into Reims, where he was at last coronated on July 17, 1429, with Joan of Arc standing beside him. Next she determined that Charles should authorize her to try to free Paris from English control. Again the king acquiesced, but this time with dire results. She was captured by the French Burgundians, English sympathizers and loyalists, who turned her over to the English. Believing she was a heretic, by all reports Joan of Arc was clairvoyant, the English burned her at the stake in Rouen, France, on May 30, 1431. She is still considered a national hero of France. Recognizing Joan of Arc for her unswerving faith and for having valiantly pursued what she believed her mission to be, the Catholic Church canonized Joan of Arc in 1920. The feast day of St. Joan of Arc is celebrated on May 30th.
Who was the first European to traverse the Bering Strait?
The Bering Strait, which connects the Arctic Ocean and the Bering Sea, is 53 miles across at its most narrow point. The first European to traverse it was Danish navigator Vitus Bering, 1681 to 1741, in 1728. The explorer, for whom the strait and the sea were named, had been employed by Tsar Peter the Great. 1672 to 1725, of Russia to determine whether Asia and North America are connected.
Who were the Minutemen?
They were volunteer soldiers, ready to take up arms at a minute's notice. Who fought for the American colonies against the British during the Revolutionary War? The Minutemen, who were trained and organized into the militia, are most well known for the battles at Lexington and Concord, on April 19, 1775, which marked the beginning of the war. They had been alerted to the approach of the British troops, or Redcoats, by the patriot Paul Revere, 1735–1818. After the fighting at Lexington and Concord, which left 250 British killed or wounded and about 90 Americans dead, word spread quickly of the fighting, and the Revolutionary War had begun.
What were the Hussite Wars?
The Hussite Wars were fought in the former Kingdom of Bohemia, part of present-day Czech Republic. Between 1420 and 1433, the country was plunged into the 13-year war by festering hostilities between papal forces and Bohemian peasants. The Hussites, named such since they were followers of religious reformer Jan Hus, c. 1373–1415, in the Four Articles of Prague, 1420, the Hussites called for freedom of preaching, limits to church property holding, and civil punishment of mortal sin. The fighting ended in 1433 with the Compromise of the Council of Basel and 3 years later was officially ended by the Compact of Igo, 1436. In which a faction of the Hussites agreed to accept the Holy Roman Emperor as king. The peasants had succeeded nevertheless in asserting Bohemian nationalism and had severed the country's ties to Germany.
What was the 100 Years' War?
The term refers to a succession of wars between England and France. The fighting began in 1337 and did not end until 1453. However, the period was not one of constant warfare. Truces and treaties brought about breaks in the military action between the countries. The reasons for the conflicts were many. England was trying to hang on to its provinces on the European continent. The French threw their support behind the Scots, who had their own battles with the English. The French wished to control the commercial centre of Flanders, present-day Belgium, where the English had set up a profitable wool trade, and finally, the two countries disagreed about who should control the English Channel, the body of water that lies between them. To further complicate matters, marriages between the English and French aristocracy meant that heirs to either throne could find themselves with a foreign relative, allowing them to lay claim to authority over the other country as well. When the First War broke out in 1337, King Edward III, 1312–1377, of England claimed the French throne on the basis of the fact that his mother, Isabella, was the daughter of France's King Philip IV. Called Philip the Fair, 1268–1314, and the sister of 3 French kings. Over the course of the next century, even though England won most of the battles and for a brief time controlled France, 1420–22, it was the French who ultimately won the war in 1453. England lost all its territory on the continent, except Calais, which was also later taken by the French, in 1558.
What was the Brumaire coup d'état?
It was the overthrow on November 9, 1799, of the French revolutionary government. The coup put Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, in power as one of 3 councils intended to head the government. While Napoleon was in Egypt and Syria waging what were for the most part successful military campaigns on behalf of the French government, there was growing discontent back home with the Directory. The group of 5 men who had governed France since 1795. His army stranded in the Middle East. Napoleon received word that France might soon be under attack by the Second Coalition, the second in a series of 6 alliances that formed in Europe in order to stave off French domination. Leaving another man in command of his troops, Napoleon hurried home where he was welcomed as a hero. Aided by his brother, Lucien Bonaparte, 1775–1840, and the French revolutionary leader Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, 1748–1836, Napoleon carried out a coup d'état, overthrowing the Directory. A consulate was formed, with the young Napoleon becoming first consul. The other councils had little influence, acting primarily as advisors to the ambitious Napoleon. The coup marked the end of the French Revolution, after the chaos and violence of the previous decade. The French people looked to Napoleon as a strong leader who could bring order to the country. They did not know that the 30-year-old possessed a seemingly insatiable hunger for power, which would soon transform the government into a dictatorship. After a brief peace, Napoleon declared himself Emperor of France on December 2, 1804. By which time he had already begun to wage a series of wars to gain himself more power in Europe.
Who was the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe?
It was English Admiral Sir Francis Drake, 1540 or 1543 to 1596. Who set out in 1577 to explore the Strait of Magellan. He did so, investigating the coast of South America. He and his crew plundered coastal Chile and Peru in the process. Before continuing into the South Pacific and heading northward, he eventually reached the coast of present-day California, which he named New Albion. A name that did not stick, and claimed it for Queen Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603. He continued sailing northward and is believed to have reached Vancouver still in search of the Northwest Passage. Not finding it, he was much too far south, explorers would later learn. He sailed westward. He reached the so-called Spice Islands, today known as the Moluccas, in East Indonesia in 1579. Drake also found the Indonesian island of Java. Before continuing west through the Indian Ocean, rounding the southern tip of South Africa at the Cape of Good Hope and skirting the western coast of Africa northward to Sierra Leone. From there Drake returned home to Plymouth, England, where he landed in 1580, the first Englishman to travel around the world. He was knighted by the Queen 1 year later. It is also Drake who, along with his fellow countryman Sir Walter Raleigh, 1554 to 1618, bears the dubious honor of introducing tobacco to his homeland. In 1586 Drake returned from another expedition to North and South America, where he did battle with Spanish fleets for control of lands. He then picked up colonists in Virginia, who carried with them potatoes and the materials and implements for tobacco smoking. Drake remained in the service of the Queen for his whole life, going on to fight and defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. On a mission to the West Indies in 1596, Drake died on board his own ship.
What was the Norman conquest?
The Norman conquest is the brief but critical period in British history that began when the French Duke William of Normandy, c. 1028 to 1087, sailed across the English Channel in 1066 and invaded England. This was upon the death of what would turn out to be England's last Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, c. 1003 to 1066. While William became known as William the Conqueror, and he did conduct a brutal conquest of Anglo-Saxon England, he might have had reason to believe he could claim the English throne upon King Edward's death. The named successor, Harold, c. 1022 to 1066, of the powerful Wessex family, had 2 years earlier become shipwrecked off the coast of France, where he reportedly took an oath that he would, upon King Edward's death, support William of Normandy, who was King Edward's distant cousin, as heir. Hearing of Edward's death, William and his army set sail for England, where Harold had already assumed the throne as King Harold II. But Harold had previously quarrelled with his brother Tostig, and the noble Wessex family was divided and engaged in a power struggle. Tostig was joined in his fight by the Norwegians who, at the same time that William was landing on England's southern coast, invaded from the north. Thus, William and his troops entered England without opposition, since Harold was focusing his efforts elsewhere. Though the king defeated the Norwegians and Tostig, who was slain in battle, he would not emerge the victor in his subsequent battle with William. On October 14 the two met in battle at Hastings, near the entrance to the Strait of Dover. Though he fought valiantly, Harold was killed. William was crowned at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066. Within a few years, by 1070, he had killed many Anglo-Saxon nobles and the rest he deprived of their land. In the 21 years of his reign, William imposed Norman aristocracy on England, required that French be spoken at court, and drew England closer to Europe. He ruled until his death in 1087. After which the Norman nobility mixed with what was left of the Anglo-Saxons. It is this intermingling that produced the English language from the German tongue of the Anglo-Saxons combined with the Norman French. William's descendants, albeit distantly so, have ruled England ever since his takeover in 1066.
What happened at Trafalgar?
Cape Trafalgar, on the southwest coast of Spain, was in 1805 the scene of a decisive victory for Great Britain over Napoleon Bonaparte's 1769–1821 navy. Other than a one-year respite in 1802, France and Britain had been at war with each other since 1793. Napoleon remained determined to conquer Britain, just as he had most of continental Europe. But when his fleets met those of decorated English Admiral Horatio Nelson, 1758–1805, off the coast of Spain, the certain defeat and destruction of Napoleon's navy ended the emperor's hopes of invading England. The confrontation at Trafalgar was the culmination of a 2-year game of cat and mouse between Nelson's fleets and the French under the direction of Admiral Villeneuve. 1763–1806, whose sole objective it was to invade Britain. To prevent this from happening, in 1803 Nelson began a 2-year blockade of Villeneuve and the French navy at Toulon, France, on the Mediterranean coast. When the French fleets escaped Toulon, attempting to lure the British out to sea, Nelson chased them all the way across the Atlantic to the West Indies and back before the showdown off Spain's coast, where the French were joined by Spanish fleets. Meantime, the coast of England remained protected by the British Navy, leaving no opportunity for invasion by the French. On October 21, 1805, seeing the enemy sailing out of Trafalgar, Nelson formed his fleet of 28 ships into 2 columns, intending to divide and conquer the combined French and Spanish force of 33 ships. About noon that day, as they prepared for the confrontation, Admiral Nelson sent out one of the most famous commands of naval history: "England expects that every man will do his duty." While the British prevailed, destroying Napoleon's fleet in less than 4 hours' time. Nelson was fatally wounded by a sharpshooter, and the English Navy hero died just as victory was his. The brave Nelson had seen fate coming, the night before Trafalgar. He had revised his will, and just before the battle had begun, he told Captain Henry Blackwood, "God bless you, Blackwood, I shall never speak to you again." Nevertheless, Nelson died knowing that he had won. uttering the still famous words, "Thank God, I have done my duty."
What became of John Cabot's son, Sebastian?
Sebastian, c. 1476 to 1557, who was born in Bristol, England, and sailed with his father on his successful expedition to North America the summer of 1497. Did not take part in his father's ill-fated venture the following year. Had he done so, the world would have lost another great adventurer. Since that expedition was never heard from again. Instead, Sebastian stayed behind and pursued his father's cause and that of other merchant navigators, who were determined to find overseas trade routes to the east. During his lifetime, Sebastian Cabot drew up maps for both the English and Spanish royalty, and from 1525 to 1528 led a Spanish expedition that reached South America's Rio de la Plata, and sailed into the Parana and Paraguay rivers. In 1544 Cabot published an engraved map of the world. And 7 years later, under a pension from King Edward VI. 1537 to 1553, he founded the Merchant Adventurers of London. This group sponsored expeditions seeking a northeast passage, around Europe, to establish a trading route to the east. In so doing, the group effected trade with Russia.
Who were the war hawks?
The Warhawks were a group of Republicans in the U.S. Congress who advocated war with Great Britain. Elected in 1810, the congressmen took office in 1811, the failure of the Erskine Agreement fresh in their memories. That bit of 1809 diplomacy, arranged by British minister to the United States George Erskine and the then U.S. Secretary of State James Madison, 1751 to 1836, would have provided for the suspension of Britain's maritime practices that interfered with U.S. shipping. But the agreement fell apart when Erskine was recalled from office. The relationship between the United States and Great Britain, tenuous since 1807 due to trade embargoes and the impressment of American sailors into British service, deteriorated. The newly elected congressmen were tired of the failure of diplomacy to resolve maritime problems with the British. They further felt that the British were challenging the young United States through their policies, which purportedly included British aid to American Indians in the Northwest. Warhawk leader Henry Clay, 1777 to 1852, was named Speaker of the House. And Congress soon passed a series of resolutions to strengthen the Army and Navy. When Congress was called upon by President James Madison to declare war on the British in June of 1812, it was the Warhawks who swung the close vote. Thus the War of 1812 was declared. Some historians believe the true motive behind the Warhawks was not resolution of the shipping problems, but rather the desire to annex parts of southern Canada to the United States.
What was the Reign of Terror?
It refers to the short but bloody period in French history that began in 1793 and ended July 1794. During this time revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre, 1758 to 1794, led a tribunal that arrested, tried, and put to death more than 17,000 people, most of them by guillotine. In the reforms that followed the 1789 oath of the Tennis Court and the capture of the Bastille, France was transformed into a constitutional state, and French subjects became French citizens. An elected legislature, the Constituent Assembly, was given control of the government. Robespierre was elected first deputy from Paris and was the leader of the Radical Popular Party. In this new era, those who had been associated with the old regime or those who opposed the French Revolution became the subjects of persecution. In January 1793, King Louis XVI, 1754 to 1793, and his wife, Marie Antoinette, 1755 to 1793, were executed, beginning the Reign of Terror that saw thousands more, mostly those who had made up the powerful First and Second Estates, suffer a similar fate at the hands of the revolutionaries. To escape certain death, many fled the country. This included top-ranking military officials, which made room for the rapid advancement of young military officers such as Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821. The Reign of Terror ended on July 28, 1794, when Robespierre himself was put to death. As he gained power and influence, the revolutionary leader also had become increasingly paranoid, even putting two of his friends to death in 1794. He was overthrown on July 27 by the revolution of 9th Thermidor, and the next day died by guillotine.
How long was it before someone reached the east by sailing west?
It was not until 1520 that a route was found. Portuguese navigator Ferdinand Magellan, c. 1480 to 1521, was on an expedition for Spain when he found a southwest passage, which took him around the southern tip of South America, through a winding waterway that still bears his name, the Strait of Magellan. Having set out from Spain in September 1519, it was a full year later before Magellan, born Fernando de Magalhães, and known in Spain as Fernando de Magallanes, reached this point. South of the South American mainland and north of the Tierra del Fuego island chain, today these islands are part of Argentina and Chile. And this was only after he had crushed a mutiny. Nevertheless, Magellan had found a connection between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. He sailed on from there, reaching the island we know as Guam on March 6, 1521. 10 days later, he discovered the Philippines. On the Philippine island of Cebu, he made an alliance with a treacherous native sovereign for whom he undertook an expedition to the nearby island of Mactan. It was there that Magellan met with his death in April 1521. His expedition continued without him. Under the direction of Juan Sebastián de Elcano, c. 1476 to 1526, who in 1522 returned to Seville, Spain. Along with 18 other survivors of the Magellan expedition. Their cargo, aboard the ship Vittoria, included valuable spices which more than paid for the expense of the expedition.
Was Attila the Hun really a savage?
While Attila, c. 406 to 453, may have possessed some of the worthwhile qualities of a military leader. The king of the Huns was no doubt a ruthless and fierce figure. He is believed to have ascended through the ranks of the Hun army, coming to power as the leader of the nomadic group in 434. By this time, the Huns, who originated in Central Asia, had occupied the Volga River Valley in the area of present-day Western Russia. At first, like his predecessors, he was wholly occupied with fighting other barbarian tribes for control of lands. But under Attila's leadership, the Huns began to extend their power into Central Europe. He waged battles with the Eastern Roman armies, and, after murdering his older brother and co-ruler Balda in 445, went on to trample the countries of the Balkan Peninsula and northern Greece, causing terrible destruction along the way. As Attila continued westward with his bloody campaigns, which each Hun fought using his own weapons and his own savage technique, he nearly destroyed the foundations of Christianity. But the combined armies of the Romans and the Visigoths defeated Attila and the Huns at Chalons, in northeastern France, in June 451, which is known as one of the most decisive battles of all time. From there, Attila and his men moved into Italy, devastating the countryside before Pope Leo I, c. 400 to 461, succeeded in persuading the brutal leader to spare Rome. For this and other reasons, Leo was later canonized, becoming Saint Leo. Attila died suddenly and of natural causes in 453. Just as he was again preparing to cross the Alps and invade Italy anew.
Who was Eleanor of Aquitaine?
Eleanor of Aquitaine, c. 1122 to 1204, was among the most powerful figures of the Middle Ages, 500-1350. Her father was William X, 1099 to 1137, the Duke of Aquitaine, one of the largest and wealthiest regions that became modern France. It extended from the Loire River to the Pyrenees Mountains. Eleanor inherited her father's vast holdings when he died in 1137, she was a teenager at the time. The same year, she married Louis VII, c. 1120 to 1180, who, within a month, succeeded his father as the King of France. As queen, Eleanor took an active role in her husband's business, even accompanying him on the Second Crusade. 1147 to 49, purportedly so that she and her numerous female attendants could care for the wounded. The expedition ended in failure, largely because of a disagreement between the king and queen about the objective. Thereafter, women were prohibited from joining the Crusades. Though Eleanor and Louis had 2 children, both daughters, they were granted an annulment of their unhappy marriage in 1152 on the grounds that they were distantly related. According to feudal law, Eleanor regained Aquitaine. Within a year she married again, to Henry Plantagenet. 1133 to 1189, of England, who was some 10 years her junior. In 1154 he became King Henry II, and Eleanor was again queen, this time of England. Though the couple had 8 children, 5 sons and 3 daughters, their marriage was stormy. Henry had liaisons with other women, the result of which was an illegitimate line of heirs to the throne. Eleanor also resented him for his attempts to control Aquitaine, which she felt was rightly hers. In 1173, when Henry and Eleanor's 3 surviving sons attempted to depose their father, Eleanor threw her support behind her sons. The rebellion failed, and Eleanor fled for France. In 1174 she was captured and returned to England, where she was put in semi-confinement by her husband. The king, until his death in 1189. Henry died while attempting to put down another rebellion by his sons. Richard the Lion-Hearted 1157 to 1199 and John Lackland 1167 to 1216. After King Henry's death, Eleanor again became a powerful force in European politics. Her son, Richard the Lion-Hearted, inherited the English throne, and she took an active role in his administration. She even stepped in for him when he left England to fight in the Crusades. When Richard died in 1199, his brother John ascended the throne. Eleanor, then in her late 70s, continued to wield power and influence. In an effort to ensure the future of the Plantagenets and to reconcile the English and French aristocracies, she arranged for one of her granddaughters to marry the son of the French king. She also managed to secure the family's land holdings in France for King John. She retired from her active political life in 1202 and died 2 years later.
If the Roman Empire was so powerful, how could it have fallen?
One could argue that the Roman Empire collapsed under its own weight. It had become too vast to be effectively controlled by any one ruler. By the close of the Punic Wars in 146 BC, Greece, Macedonia, and the Mediterranean coasts of Spain and Africa had been brought under Roman control. Within a century, Rome again began to expand overseas. under the Roman general Pompey, 106 to 48 BC. Eastern Asia Minor, Syria, and Judea, Palestine, were conquered. Next, Gaul was conquered by Pompey's rival, Julius Caesar, 100 to 44 BC. Adding the territory west of Europe's Rhine River to the Roman world. In 31 BC, in the Battle of Actium, Octavian 63b.ca.d.14, Julius Caesar's adopted son and heir, defeated the forces of Mark Antony, c. 83 to 30 BC. And Cleopatra, 69 to 30 BC, Queen of Egypt, and in 30 BC Egypt became a Roman province. In 27 BC Octavian became the first Roman emperor and was known as Augustus, meaning exalted. Though Octavian's rule marked the beginning of the long period of stability called the Pax Romana. The Roman Empire had become so large, stretching across Europe and parts of Africa and the Middle East, that only a strong, central authority could govern it. During the 200 years of the Pax Romana, Rome's emperors gradually grew more powerful, to the point that after death an emperor was worshipped by the people. But soon there were threats to this central control, not the least of which was the spread of Christianity, as well as invasions from the Germanic Goths and the Persians. Theodosius I, 379 to 395, was the last emperor to rule the entire Roman Empire. When he died in AD 395, the empire was split into the West Roman Empire and the East Roman Empire, setting the stage for the decline of the Romans. The West Roman Empire came under a series of attacks by various Germanic tribes, including the Vandals and the Visigoths, the western division of the Goths, who invaded Spain, Gaul, in Western Europe, and Northern Africa. These assaults eventually led to the disintegration of the West Roman Empire by 476. The East Roman Empire remained more or less intact, but it became known as the Byzantine Empire, and was predominantly a Greek-oriented culture from 476 until 1453, when it fell to the Turks.
Who said Veni, Vidi, Vici, and what does it mean?
The famous words were written by Roman statesman and general Julius Caesar, 100 to 44 BC, as he announced the victory of his army in Asia Minor in early August 47 BC. The extraordinarily concise message, which Caesar dispatched to Rome, means simply I came, I saw, I conquered. The general had defeated Pharnaces II, 63 to 47 BC. In a fight for control of Pontus, an ancient kingdom in Northeast Asia Minor. The brief but decisive battle took place near Zela, in present-day Turkey.
What was the impact of the 100 Years' War?
After waging war with each other for more than a century, in 1453, both England and France emerged as stronger, centralized governments. As the governments had gained strength, the nobility in both countries found themselves with less power and influence than they had enjoyed previously, and the system of feudalism, which before the war had been necessary in the absence of a larger, protective entity, was on the decline. In their strategies against each other, both countries had developed new military tactics. And though England had fewer resources than did France, it still managed to assert itself at sea, marking the beginning of that country's naval prowess.
Who was the first woman to circumnavigate the globe?
It was a young French woman named Jeanne Barrot. In 1766 Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, 1729–1811, a French naval officer, undertook an around-the-world expedition, which was successful and returned to France in 1769. But the crew made an interesting discovery en route. When the French arrived in Tahiti, the Tahitians immediately noticed something the crew had not, that one of the servants on the expedition was a woman. Jeanne Barrot had been hired in France by one of the ship's officers, Khmer Khan, who also served as botanist for the expedition. Khmer Khan did not know Barrot was a woman. Her secret discovered by the Tahitians, she confessed, revealing that she was an orphan who had first disguised herself as a boy to get employment as a valet. When she learned about Bougainville's expedition, she decided to continue the disguise in order to carry out an adventure that would have been impossible for a woman in that day. She was the first woman known to have circled the globe.
Who was Genghis Khan?
He was a Mongol conqueror who rose to power in the early 13th century. To rule over one of the greatest continental empires the world has seen. Born Temujin, c. 1167–1227, he was named Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. In 1206, he was a fearless military leader, a brilliant strategist, and a ruthless subjugator, known for his brutal methods. Temujin was the firstborn son of the leader of a small nomadic clan. When he was a young boy, his father was killed by a neighboring tribe, Tatars, and thus he rose to the status of chief. But instead of allowing a boy to lead them, clan members abandoned Temujin and his family. He survived the hard-scrabbled youth of a destitute nomad. But by all accounts, he seemed destined to become a great leader. By the time he was 20 years old, Temujin had managed to forge alliances with various tribal leaders and claimed the leadership of a small clan. By 1189 he united two Mongol tribes, which he organized to conquer the rival Tatars by the year 1202. At a conference of Mongol leaders in 1206, Temujin was pronounced the great ruler, or Genghis Khan, of the unified Mongolian state. he began a transformation of the Mongol tribes, dividing them into military units, each one supported by a number of households. He imposed law and order, promoted education, and stimulated economic prosperity. Within 5 years, Mongol society was changed from a nomadic tribal to a military feudal system. Thus organized, Genghis Khan prepared his troops to expand the Mongolian Empire. Genghis Khan's armies embarked on a series of military campaigns, claiming land and subjugating peoples, sometimes using barbaric methods. By 1213 he controlled northern China to the Great Wall. By 1219 he controlled most of China and began campaigns into the Muslim world. When he died in the field in 1227, Genghis Khan commanded the vast territory from China to the Caspian Sea. He was succeeded by his sons, who continued to expand the Mongol holdings. His grandson was Kublai Khan, 1215 to 1294, under whose leadership the Mongolian Empire reached its pinnacle.
Why did the Russians burn Moscow?
The September 14, 1812, torching of their own city was directed by Tsar Alexander I. 1777 to 1825, who wished to prevent Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821, and his invading armies from reaping the benefits of anything Russian. Through a series of wars, Napoleon had dominated most of Europe by 1805. The authority of Alexander was certainly threatened by the French emperor. In 1805 and 1807 Russia suffered major losses in battles with Napoleon's armies. In the face of these defeats, what Alexander did next was a stroke of genius. Though he had many detractors at the time, Napoleon's forces, though victorious, were weary from fighting and were unable to pursue the Russian armies further. So, Alexander made peace with the emperor in the Treaty of Tilsit, 1807. The Russian ruler vowed support of Napoleon, and for his part, Napoleon believed Alexander had extended him a hand of friendship. Instead, the cunning Russian ruler had bought himself and his country the time they needed to gird themselves against powerful Napoleon. By 1812 Russia, its economy dependent on exports, resumed trade with Great Britain, Napoleon's archenemy. This prompted the return of Napoleon's troops to Russia. Later that year the French emperor marched into Russia with a force of as many as 600,000 men, but the Russians still delivered Napoleon a crushing defeat. The Russian army had relied on guerrilla warfare tactics, including burning their own countryside. Napoleon returned to Paris in defeat by the end of the year.
How long did the French Revolution last?
The revolution lasted some 10 years, and it grew increasingly violent as it progressed. It began in mid-1789 when the government found itself nearly bankrupt, and due to festering discontent among the commoners. The prosperous middle class included, that crisis quickly grew into a movement of reform. The revolution ended in 1799 when French General Napoleon Bonaparte 1769 to 1821, seized control of the government. Democracy had not been established in France, but the revolution had ended the supreme authority of the king, had strengthened the middle class, and had sent the message across Europe that the tenets of liberty and equality are not to be ignored.
What were the French holdings in the New World?
The French possessions in North America, called New France, consisted of the colonies of Canada, Acadia, and Louisiana. The first land claims were made in 1534 by French explorer Jacques Cartier. 1491 to 1557, as he sailed the St. Lawrence River in eastern Canada. In 1604 Sieur de Mons, Pierre Duguay, c. 1568 c. 1630, established a settlement at Acadia. In present-day Nova Scotia, Canada, and French claims later extended the region to include what are today the province of New Brunswick and the eastern part of the state of Maine. After founding Quebec in 1608, explorer Samuel de Champlain, c. 1567 to 1635, penetrated the interior, present-day Ontario, as far as Georgian Bay on Lake Huron, extending French land claims westward. In 1672 French-Canadian explorer Louis Joliet 1645 to 1700, and French missionary Jacques Marquette 1637 to 1675, became the first Europeans to discover the upper part of the Mississippi River. 10 years later, French explorer Sieur de La Salle, 1643 to 1687, followed the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico, claiming the river valley for France and naming it Louisiana. While the French expanded their North American claims, the majority of French settlers lived in Canada. France lost Canada to Great Britain in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63. Louisiana changed hands numerous times before it was finally sold to the United States in 1803 as part of the Louisiana Purchase. It was France's last claim on the North American mainland. French culture and influence in these areas remains prevalent today. In 1635 the French also claimed the West Indies islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe, and its small surrounding islands, including Saint Barthélemy. In 1946 the French government changed the status of these islands from colonies to overseas departments.
What caused the War of 1812?
The war between the young United States and powerful Great Britain largely came about because of France. After the French Navy was crushed by the British under Admiral Nelson, 1758 to 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, Napoleon turned to economic warfare in his long struggle with the British. he directed all countries under French control not to trade with Great Britain. Its economy dependent on trade, Britain struck back by imposing a naval blockade on France, which soon interfered with U.S. shipping. Ever since the struggle between the two European powers began in 1793, the United States tried to remain neutral. But the interruption of shipping to and from the continent and the search and seizure of ships posed significant problems to the American export business. In 1807, Great Britain had issued an order in council that required even neutral vessels destined for a continental port to stop first in England. Napoleon countered with the Milan Decree, which stated that any neutral vessel that had submitted to British search be seized. Back in America, the people of New England, the region most dependent on shipping, nevertheless vehemently opposed entering into war with the British. But the country's economy was depressed as a result of the interruption of exports, and the U.S. Congress declared war on June 18, 1812. In these days before telegraph and radio, the United States did not know that 2 days before, on June 16, Britain had withdrawn its orders in council, lifting its policy of shipping interference, which had been the chief reason for the war declaration. Thus the two countries engaged in fighting for the next 2.5 years. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent officially ended the war. But once again, poor communication led to fighting, 2 weeks after the treaty was signed. Troops in New Orleans, unaware of this event, fought for control over the Mississippi River in the worst battle of the entire conflict. Though both the United States and Great Britain claimed victory in the War of 1812, neither side had gained anything.